Hello, this is Hülya Adak. Welcome to the third panel of the day. And our two of our speakers will actually be presenting in English. That's why we're going to continue in English. So
welcome everybody. This is the third panel of the conference, Minority Rights in the Centennial of the Republic. My name is Hülya Adak. I'm very excited to be here. We've been listening to an amazing lineup of speakers since the morning. I just wanted to thank the Hrant Dink Foundation and all the organizers of this amazing conference. Number one, I also wanted to emphasize what an important topic they've chosen for the Centennial of the Republic. We've been going to many conferences, but I think this topic is of utmost interest given the problematics in the region and in the international scene at large. Ayhan Akhtar mentioned how we've been spending weeks watching a genocide in Gaza, and there have been a number of crises that are actually coming into our discussions here in this very, very important as part of these important discussions. I also want to commend the Foundation for launching the Minority Rights Academy, which I find extremely, extremely important. And I think it'll be beneficial to many different activists, students, and scholars at large. So congratulations for all of those. Till this panel, we've been listening to amazing analyses of institutions. There were discussions on the League of Nations, on the UN. We've also been listening to amazingly critical talks on treaties so far, looking at Sèvres, Lausanne, doing some comparative analyses. They were all extremely important. As we move on to this particular panel, and it's going to be on identities, most specifically, identities and recognitions. I think we're taking a historical turn, not that we didn't do it so far, but this is going to be particularly based on historical research. And we have brilliant scholars lined up looking at cutting-edge research on local historiography. So I think that's going to be the sort of divisive and unique aspect of this particular panel. And we're going to look at hitherto unacknowledged historical turning points. For instance, there's going to be an analysis of the 1950 to 1974 moment, bringing the Cyprus issue into the discussion of how minority rights were discussed and implemented, or the kinds of discriminations that occurred during this time. We also are going to address multiple sites of belonging, so not single belongings, but multiple sites where we really complicate our understandings of how some of these identities work out. The concrete examples from this panel include Arabic-speaking Christian communities in Antioch, for instance, as our first paper, the Armenian community in Greece, and Hakkâri Assyrians. So I think these amazingly complicated identity formations should really enrich our discussions so far. What I found lacking in the previous discussions was this element of intersectionality, and I hope that will be brought into discussion either as part of this panel or in later panels, where we're going to be hopefully discussing multiple sites of discrimination and overlapping dimensions of discrimination. So I hope that will be part of the debates after the papers. Another missing aspect of our discussions, I thought, was gender. I hope we can address the elements of gender-based discrimination and violence that have hitherto been dismissed, and the fact that identities and identity formations also fluctuate and change. So one of the papers I see today addresses this issue, but what it means to be an Armenian or part of the Christian community in the 50s, 70s might not correspond to what it means to be part of this community today. So an acknowledgement about how these identities are also in flux would be really essential. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce some of the scholars. Our first speaker is going to be Emre Dağlıoğlu, who's renowned to many of the spectators, I think, or guests today. Emre Can is a PhD student in the Department of History at Stanford University. He did graduate studies at the Department of Cultural Studies at Istanbul Bilgi University and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. Emre Can has published extensively on non-dominant groups in late Ottoman and Turkish history. Currently, his research focuses on examining the impact of global capitalism on financial networks, sociopolitical dynamics, and environmental changes within the late Ottoman Empire. Further, he likes to think about the history of the left in the Middle East, and in addition to their academic pursuits, Emre Can serves as an editor for Nehna. So we're very pleased that Emre Can is with us today, and the title of his presentation is The Liminality of the Antiochian Arabic-speaking Orthodox Identity in Republican History. So thank you, Emre Can, for joining us.
Teşekkür ederim hocam. Öncelikle
So yes, first of all, I'd like to also thank the Hrant Dink Foundation for bringing us together and everyone who worked behind the scenes to make it possible. And just to correct myself at the very outset, I have 3 notes to share with you. And actually, you know, Antakyalı I use in my title, and I would add İskenderun to that. Actually, İskenderun is as important as Antakya, and it's quite different than Antakya. So I called myself Antakyalı from Antakya in the title, but I think maybe I should have included İskenderun as well. And also say Arab Orthodox instead of Arabic-speaking Orthodox. These definitions change over time, and I actually define myself as an Arab Orthodox, but a vast majority of the community is not on the same page with me about this. So I think I was being a bit political, but I would today call myself Arab Orthodox, and the word Liminality, I mean, that's a funny, that's an odd liminality. That's an odd word. So basically, all in all, we're talking about a difficult to describe community. Who are these people? That's what I wanted to emphasize, because I've been grappling with this question for the entirety of my life. I mean, 2 years ago we set up Nehna, and up until then, I mean, a vast majority of my life was dedicated to explaining to people, new acquaintances, who I was, what I was. My name is quite Turkish, but I'm not Muslim, and I come from outside Turkey. I'm a Christian coming from outside Istanbul. I'm not a Syriac. My mother tongue is Arabic, but I am not a Maronite, and all of these were quite problematic for me at certain points in my life. And actually, the reason why I had all these dialogues can be classified in 3 categories. The first of which is as follows. The society, the identity of the society or the community is usually described by a central authority. But for my community, that has never been the case. We don't have an identity that is standardized, so it's quite flexible, it's quite fluid, it's quite prone to change, and you cannot delineate it very easily. And secondly, here's what I could say. For the last 30 years, about minority communities in Turkey, we've had a huge accumulation of literature, but there is one thing that should not be overlooked, and it is this. Even this literature that focuses on minorities, or this field of minority studies, actually mainly focuses on urban people, urbanites, such as people of Istanbul or minorities living in Istanbul before the earthquake, in Hatay, in Arsuz, Antakya, Altınözü, Samandağ, İskenderun districts, and in Mersin as well. 11,000 people lived, and 2,000 members of the same community live in Istanbul, but there were no studies about these communities in Antakya and its environs. So actually, this is the this makes it really challenging to think about this identity, and there haven't been many efforts to do that. And another preventive factor, or something that precludes the academia into venturing into this, is the hierarchy of the church, of the liturgy. In the 20s and 30s, this community, some European specialists and jurors thought about this community, and they had discussions that lasted for days, and they couldn't really reach a conclusion. The Patriarchate in Antakya is actually in Damascus right now, in Syria, but the name still has Antioch in it. For the last 70 years, there has been occupation in Palestine, and currently there is a genocide that is unfolding in our eyes. And in Jerusalem, we have a patriarchate, and Hellenites are members of that patriarchate. As for the one in Damascus, the community is Arabic, but they're known as Greek Orthodox, and Greek Rum is not necessarily ethnic always, so it's quite complicated. So it's a bit of a mess, if I'm honest. So yeah, this is the quagmire that we find ourselves in. So states and international powers that be introduced in the 20s and 30s this homogeneous population idealization, and the identity here is actually shared by people who are almost identical, with one another. And obviously, this is a straitjacket that doesn't fit the reality. And all across the history of the Republic, this has changed. The perception of this flexibility has changed, and I'm going to present you with a couple of vignettes about that. Churches, the international law, the community itself, how they perceive identity and how it has changed over the years. But one more thing before I begin: this flexibility, this fluidity in identities, when it comes to also class relations within the society, they also apply. And also, I talked about districts in Antakya, for instance. These are localities, and even these localities are quite important, I would say. And here's how we should begin. Now, as you would guess, in 39, Hatay was annexed by Turkey, but obviously there is the exchange that took place before that. In February 24, this process started. The population exchange decision was made, and in November and December 23, there was this debate in Turkey, the Arab-speaking Orthodox in Mersin. Should they be sent away or not? And in November and December, Turkey responded as follows: yes, they should be exchanged, and their exchange procedures were actually initiated. But come February 24, the person, the committee, the mixed committee in charge of this exchange, and the subcommittee in Mersin received a letter, and in this letter it is stated that certain people living in Mersin, Arab Orthodox, refused to be sent to Greece as part of the population exchange. And then this is cascaded to the committee, and in June 24, after deliberations, process is initiated, which would last 3.5 years. So the gist of this debate was, who is a Greek Orthodox? According to the population exchange deal, Muslims living in Greece and Greek Orthodox living in Turkey would be quote-unquote exchanged. So in this discussion, the Greek delegation said those who are not affiliated with Hellenism, those who do not speak Greek, should not be received by Greece. That was their line of defense. And the Greek side, when they what they understood by Greek Orthodox was ethnicity, but the Turkey side wanted to define it as not ethnically Greek, but religiously affiliated with the identity of Greek Orthodox community. So this was a lengthy back and forth, and there were three Europeans in the committee as well, and they somehow found it very difficult to make a decision. Head of the Turkish delegation, Tevfik Rüştü Aras, wanted to propose a solution to this problem, and the people in Mersin, these Arab Orthodox, their properties should be confiscated, he said, therefore rendering them desperate so that they would willingly want to go to Greece. Be in a position to want to go to Greece. But Turkey never did this, really. Never ever did Turkey turn this into reality. But the committee in May 27 made a proclamation. Greek Orthodox means members of all, do not mean members of all the Eastern churches. And in December 27, the final decision was made. Greek, Rum Orthodox, Greek Orthodox meant people who are affiliated with the Patriarchate in Istanbul, they said. So if you're not a member of the Istanbul Patriarchate as a Greek Orthodox, then you're not a Greek, and it is decided that you're not a Greek Orthodox. And also the title here, the article here, isn't the committee a party? This was about a decision made in December. Turkey didn't favor that decision. This was a backlash against that, and a decision published yesterday is highly contentious, says the news article. And then in the third line, it says the committee yesterday talked about Arab Orthodox and how they should not be dealt within the framework of the population exchange. So for 4 years, Arab Orthodox, this description was used extensively. Now let us go to 1936. After this panel, Seda Altu is going to focus on this really brilliantly, so I'm going to keep it very short. I'm just going to tell you about what world was like in 36. Syria becomes independent from France. And this there's this new province, Iskenderun province. There's this provincial area, and there's a debate about what the status should be. In 36, the demographics of this province. Let's take a look at who lived there. And here, as it indicates here, Ms. Williams reports that no one is in the majority. Every group is in the minority. It's quite a complicated and mixed picture. But of course, there would be intervention, and with Syria, Turkey will not accept that province to be independent with Syria. And in 36, there is going to be a counteraction to make sure that this province is not a part of Syria. In 36, at this very point, well, the Ismail Müştak Mayakon publishes an article, and a new name is bestowed upon this locale, which is Hatay, on the 10th of October 36. With this article, the name Hatay is used for the first time in December 36. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk adopts this name as well, and for Turkey, it becomes Hatay. The entire province becomes Hatay. Prior to that, there is no such word in use, but this was a step towards annexation for Turkey to annex this land, and this was a first step to do that, to change the name or use a different name. And then this was conveyed to the League of Nations, and League of Nations, after a lot of back and forth, rapporteurs, this and that, in 37 grants a special status to this province. And in order to put this to use in this province, parliamentary elections would take place, a council would be elected, and how to do that is also stipulated by this special status. People living in this locale are divided into 7 categories based on their race and ethnicity: Turk, Alevi, Arab, Armenian, Greek Orthodox, Kurds, and others. And actually, Keith Wotton's definition is quite applicable here. Um, the colonial, ethnic election manipulation is what he called it. And the Arab category, for instance, you have, I mean, many Alevis who are Arabs are not in the Arab category. Alevis are presented as a different category, and we don't know why that was done. And if we're going to look at ethnicities, I mean, in Armenians, why do we have no distinction between Catholic, Apostolic, and Protestant? And also, more interestingly, like I said, in 28 in the region, people living in the region and people who were affiliated with the Antakya Patriarchate were not described as Greek Orthodox, but come 38, they suddenly become Greek Orthodox people. So this is again used. And obviously, this was also not enough. In 38, a protocol was signed between France and Turkey, and as per this protocol, the region was actually left to Turkey. But to make it look official, the League of Nations also stepped in, and there were some violent incidents of violence, and the League of Nations left the region. And as they were leaving the region, they shared the consensus results. In 38, there was no majority in the region, but according to the Turkish census data, on the 1st of August, we see that 63% is Turkish, for instance, in the region, and as such, in September 38, the first council would convene, and two Greek Orthodox MPs would serve in the assembly. In 38, it becomes a part of Turkey, and there's this huge influx of Orthodox people to other places. Some people say 11,000 people. That may be a bit of an exaggeration. The total population, as per French records, was 13,000. So most probably it was around 5,000 Orthodox people who fled to Syria, Lebanon, and countries beyond. That is what we could say. And obviously, the class status is really indicative when it comes to immigration. If you're politically invested in Turkey, if you're established in Turkey, if you're a part of the elite class, then you stay in Turkey. But those who were less established, lower classes, actually opted to migrate to other countries. Now, as such, the Turkish period begins in the region, and this means loss of education in native language. All the Arab schools were closed down, and there were discriminatory political steps that were taken, and that's par for the course for minorities in Turkey, as you know. And there were reflections of international policies in the region. The Cyprus issue will pop up, and there's going to be a confusion vis-a-vis identity. I mean, churches are hindered, and there are no schools in teaching in native tongue. So, and also the tax on the, property tax, and this had an impact on the local population, and people who opted to stay in Turkey, the elites, they all of a sudden incurred these huge debts, and on the 6th and 7th of September, there was no anti-Christian uprising, but Nicola Church, a couple of days later, survived a dynamite attack. So, come 58, Cyprus issue popped up, and this brought about a lot of tension. The identity of Rum, Greek, which is seen as dangerous, people shunned that identity, and the Turkish Orthodox emphasis was used much more extensively. And here's a quote from Supi Levent, the proprietor of İskenderun Daily. He is a member of our community. In 58, in the Cyprus demonstrations in Iskenderun, he actually made a speech at the rally, and he said repeatedly, Turkish Orthodox, Turkish Orthodox, but people of the Turkish race, he said, but he knows that he's not a member of the Turkish race as such. And Similarly, in all these rallies in 58, these happened, and in Christmas of 63 or December of 63, there's another crisis, and Antakya, head of the community, and the archbishop of the church, also sent a telegram to the government, and again used the phraseology Turkish Orthodox in Antakya. Turkish Orthodox, I mean, you see it in title deeds, for instance, in the 50s and 60s, and in the 90s. When people started discussing these property ownership issues, this would lead to a crisis. The exile of 64, this also had a huge impact on the people who held Greek passports but who lived in Turkey. So we were not directly affected, but when we look at the Iskenderun daily, we see that they just mimic the mainstream media, the discourse used by the mainstream media in Istanbul. But people, when it comes to exile from Iskenderun and Hatay, they were not they were not using the same language. They used a much more neutral language, and there's a bit of an alienation here as well. We're talking about members of the same community, but there's a bit of a distance, and we don't see any emotion about the fact that these people are being sent away to Greece. But it's quite telling, actually. In the 60s. People started to flock to big cities and to other countries, and there's a big wave of immigration in the 70s to Istanbul, and this is the first encounter with the Greeks in Istanbul, and we still actually have this sense of ostracization, and that first started here in the 70s when these people came to Istanbul. In 68, for the first time, the government proclaims that they do not see us as Greeks, and as such we cannot go to Greek schools. There's a directive that precludes us from going to Greek schools, and then there's a big influx to Greece and to Germany, and after the 74 Cyprus operation, again, this affects the community tremendously. People are pursued, their lines are cut off, certain churches cannot even be opened, and of course, there's disenfranchisement that is brought about by the 36 Declaration. The 36 Declaration does not apply to foundations in Hatay, because in 36 there is no province called Hatay in Turkey, but again, because of this declaration, many people lost their properties. And also, one more thing, in 74, this process of disenfranchisement through hearsay goes to Altınözü village, and people are told that certain properties would be confiscated. The church, the church is actually, the title deed is changed. The church is taken from the foundation and is given to the muhtar in the region. And then after the earthquake, we realized that there was no official proprietor of this church in the title records. And in the 12th of September, the coup ended the rural Christianity in Turkey, and this coup gave way to a lot of illegal practices and transfer of property, and also it also made sure that no Christians remained in the rural areas. And come 2000s, let me add one more thing, this Turkish Orthodox versus Greek Orthodox shift. In the 90s, people started to reclaim the Greek Orthodox title. Istanbul Greeks dwindled in terms of population, and at school, student populations went down considerably, so this was substituted by students coming from Antakya and Mersin.
Başka bir eğitim.
This being the case, a new education system, a new generation came along also to have the belonging of the Greek Orthodox identity. This is how people started to define themselves, how they start to identify themselves. And then restitution of confiscated properties. This is something you all know very well. In the case of Hatay, there was a problem of accessibility, and this again stems from 36 declaration, because properties were confiscated based on 36 declaration. But then the restitution did not really happen for the community foundations in Hatay, because this dispossession actually came once community foundations were declared annexed foundations, and in Arsus, which is a small town, even the main church had to lose its property because they didn't have the priest, the bishop, they couldn't do the religious service, they couldn't also keep their records properly. So the church in Arsus was declared an annexed foundation, and right now they don't have any property. It belongs to the General Directorate of Foundations. So this is the consequence, and it's because of the lack of capacity of the church and community. So as a result, the devastating earthquake that hit on February 6th in a way surfaced all these problems. I have a few last sentences.
Yani hem Altınözü'nde 2
So in Altınözü we have 2 churches that were destroyed during the earthquake, and of course the people are now facing the threat of migration significantly. There was a great devastation in Antakya, and if I'm not mistaken, there are still some people in the community, but it is fair to say that there is no Christian community left in Antakya as of today. And now we have this law on urban transformation and the new zoning law. So along with these new legal amendments, there are attempts to do more urban transformation projects, which will definitely lead to more of dispossession. That's why we need even a more organized struggle, but we can't even put together such kind of an initiative. We cannot really bring together those institutions, and this exacerbates the problems. So yes, we are deprived of the mother tongue. We are having problems in terms of accessing our rights. But sometimes this flexibility, this flexible nature of our identity gives us some leeways. We can somehow just sneak out some occasions. For instance, the oppression or discrimination faced by Istanbul Rooms, Istanbul Greek Orthodox community, is not exactly the same for our community. So at a time that Istanbul Greeks are under great oppression, we have a relative calm in our community. And this is again the advantage of having such a flexible, fluid identity. So with that, I would like to conclude my remarks.
Biz de çok teşekkür ediyoruz Emre'ciğim.
We would like to thank Emre Dağlıoğlu for this paper.
Leonidas, Ntilsizian? Yeah. Levon received his PhD in this year actually, from the Department of Political Science and History at Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences. His dissertation is about Armenians' historical presence in Greece and Greek-Armenian relations. He holds a BSc in Political Science and History from the Department of Political Science and History, Pantheon University again, and an MSc in Southeastern European Studies from the Department of Political Science at the University of Athens. His research interests focus on Balkan history, foreign policy, and minority issues. Levon will talk to us today about the historical development of the Armenian community in Greece through the Greek state's minority policy and practices. Thank you, Levon, for being with us today.
Thank you, and I would also to thank the Hrant Foundation for bringing us together and for this opportunity to present our research. Armenians' community modern formation in Greece goes back to the end of the 19th century or even earlier. Roots of the Armenian presence in Greece can be traced even before the 17th century. In the slide, you can see the Armenian temple in the Dimotiko dating back to the 15th century. Despite the important role Greece's Armenian community has played in Greek affairs and the significant number of its members, up to today it remains to a large extent an unexplored field of research. The chronological period examined in this presentation starts in 1922 until Armenians' community legal recognition in 2004, focusing mainly on the interwar, post-war and Cold War years. A brief presentation of the community will be attempted in the light of Greek state's minority policy, examining three issues. Firstly, citizenship. Secondly, education, as two key factors which both influence Armenians' daily life and which explain both aspects of communities' development. Thirdly, special weight is given to the diachronic refusal for granting a legal status to the Armenian regional communities in Greece and to the efforts made by the Armenians for communities' legal recognition. From the early beginning, it is underlined that the repatriation from Greece, the years 1946-1947, when more than 18,000 Armenians fled from Greece to Soviet Armenia, is a turning point which determined communities' presence in Greece. Let me start with the issue of citizenship, one of the most complex but fundamental issues concerning Greek state's relations with the Armenians in Greece. As soon as thousands of refugees arrived in the Greek territories, the years 1922-1923, the issue of citizenship emerged. Greece's defeat in the Asia Minor in 1922 was followed by a homogeneous state policy, a policy based not only on common language, national consciousness or religion, but to the political and national ideology as well. A strict distinction based on the term genos, descent, was inaugurated shaping state's minority policy. Among other minority groups, the Armenians as well were included into the category of allogenes, of non-Greek descent populations. The Armenian element had been characterized as stateless and of undefined citizenship. The large majority of the Armenians settled in Greece were immediately excluded from previous favorable citizenship laws. For instance, the law of 1920, with which a significant number of Armenians settled in Thrace had previously succeeded in granting the Greek citizenship. Armenians' exclusion from Greek citizenship had taken place in a period when immigration and repatriation waves, encouraged by the Greek authorities in combination with the international community, started shrinking the numbers of the Armenians in Greece. At the same time, the Armenians in northern Greece were displaced in the southern regions of Greece. It was the need to settle the Greek Orthodox refugees from Turkey, implementing the exchange population agreement based on the Treaty of Lausanne. But at the same time, it was the untold political decision to dismantle the united and solid Armenians' national community character. A decision reinforced by the fact that these communities were established in an area neighboring to the Bulgarian borders. In the slide, you can see an article in the Greek newspaper Macedonia of June 1924, with which the Armenians, in which has the title that the Armenians ask for citizenship. However, a number of administrative obstacles emerged by the Greek authorities strongly prevented Armenians' naturalization. Just a limited number would benefit from a legislative degree with which, in theory only, the Armenians could apply that period for citizenship. Armenian stateless character led to the protection provided by the international community. Armenians were granted the so-called non-sent passports, which ensured the right to immigrate to another country without securing the Greek citizenship. In the 30s, more and more Armenians who remained in the country would gradually apply for citizenship. The authoritarian policies implemented by the dictatorship under the Prime Minister General Ioannis Metaxas, the picture you can see, had a serious and long-lasting impact on minorities. Approximately 20,000 citizenship applications submitted by the Armenians were estimated to be pending in 1938. The compulsory law ratified in 1940 by the Metaxas dictatorship regime sealed Armenians' Greek citizenship abolition. The Greek citizenship had been retrospectively deprived for a group of Armenians and Circassians. According to this law, the compulsory law, military service fulfillment in the Greek army was set as an additional precondition for citizenship. Due to this term, a large number of Armenians lost citizenship. The Metaxas legislation had been widely implemented in the post-war and Greek Civil War years when a large number of Armenians lost their citizenship. Throughout the Greek Civil War, minority groups were treated as potential national enemies. A significant number of Armenians were deleted from official census and from municipal registration lists as soon as they left Greece for Bulgaria and mainly for Soviet Armenia. As soon as the repatriation and the exodus to Soviet Armenia was carried out, Armenians were declared by the Greek state to have lost their Greek citizenship in a massive and systematic manner. They were considered as non-Greek persons who left Greece with no intention to return. Those who in the upcoming years will express their will to return, they will not be allowed to, since their departure had been realized under the condition of without intention to re-entry to the Greek state. In this slide, you can see a document with which two Armenians from Kozani in northern Greece had been deleted from the municipality registrations. And in another case, a more massive case of 9 Armenians who had also been deleted from the municipality census of Drama in 1949, and they had signed this document that they have no intention to re-entry to the Greek state, so they could not come back again in the future. During the 50s, the Ministry of the Interior started in a systematic way to list the non-naturalized Armenians of Greece not anymore as undefined citizens, but as Turkish citizens. This new policy disrupted states' relations with the Armenians of Greece. Finally, it was the Greek dictatorship regime in August 1968 which paved the way for acquisition of citizenship. The compulsory law of 1968 modified critical points of the Greek citizenship code in favor of certain minority groups in an attempt to liberalize the regime and approach the international community. Together with the Roma, the administrative obstacles were removed for the Armenians as well. However, for the next decades, Armenians who will apply for citizenship will still be considered as allogenes of non-Greek descent, continuing the ongoing discrimination against them. The institutional settlement will be restored only in 2018, when a circular signed by the Ministry of the Interior finally abolished this long-standing distinction. As it has been initially explained, the repatriation during the Greek Civil War defined the community and its role in Greece. The around 10,000 Armenians who remained in Greece in the 50s, consisting of the Armenian community in Greece, were faced with the unresolved issue of community's legal status. It was during that time that came in surface, and to its entire extent, the fact that the Armenian community itself in the Greek state historically, and from the early beginning, had not been legally restored. It had no legal status, or to put it differently, the community itself had no legal self-existence under the internal legal system. Lack of such recognition had an obvious impact on community's functioning. The community itself could not have one and united legal voice, for instance in a court, could not manage its enormous property, or even receive any special tax treatment, rights that could not be exerted by the Armenian Church headquarters, which remained for decades invisible for the state. Under this reality, the Armenian Central Committee sought community's recognition in the form of a legal entity under public law, as it was the case for the sovereign Greek Orthodox Church. The Central Committee and the Armenian Archiepiscop were applying repeatedly in the 50s and 60s so as the Greek government to grant the legal status, but in vain. For the Greek state, legally visible had only been the national parish councils, the Askain Tahagan Horurt, which were recognized by the administrative and judicial authorities, as they constituted the body, Marmin, of the regional Armenian churches, which were the only ones with a legal personality. The Greek side seemed to make a distinction between, on the one hand, the invisible Armenian communities and the Armenian Church, which did not constitute self-sustaining legal entities, and on the other hand, the temples of the Armenian Apostolic Church, which were granted the right to function as legal private, not public, law persons or entities under the legal form of a foundation. However, in practice, for the Greek state, the Armenian Metropolitan and Archiepiscop had been recognized as the spiritual leader of the Gregorian Armenians and with whom he maintained all necessary daily contacts for community's needs, even though de jure he had not been recognized. The function of the whole community's administrative pyramid, at the top of which is the Metropolis and the National Central Council, would not be hindered in practice, but it would remain invisible for the formal institutions. Under these circumstances, informally, the Armenian regional communities would be internally organized and regulated by the Armenian National Constitution, as issued during the Ottoman Empire in 1863. However, Armenian substantial demand for communities' legal status remained pending for decades. The Greek state refused to grant a legal personality to other minority groups as well. Any legal recognition would automatically lead to an official minority status and would create certain obligations for the Greek state. Furthermore, the non-recognition status would serve the goal for gradual integration into the Greek social and economic life. In the case of Armenians, the Ministry of Education insisted through this period to ensure exclusively the religious freedom, the only and one contractual obligation deriving from the Greek constitution and the international treaties, without proceeding to any further action. According to the Ministry of the Interior 1952 secret report, Greece's obligations towards the Armenians were just protection of life, liberty, free exercise of religious duties, and free organization of Armenians at their own expense. In the same report, the Ministry of the Interior considered the Armenian element as pro-Soviet and pro-communist, willing to encourage every attempt for repatriation or immigration to another country outside the Greek borders. Throughout this period, there existed an unspoken fear on the part of the Greek side not to give in to a development that would potentially open a window for legalization of another minority inside the country. The legal status remained unresolved for many decades in a state of silence under a modus vivendi based on mutual tolerance in the context of common effort not to disrupt bilateral relations. Until very recently, in 2014, when the religious legal entity of private law had been granted exclusively to religious communities. It was only then that the Catholic Church, the Copts, the Ethiopian Orthodox, the Assyrians, the Anglicans, the Greek Evangelical Church, and the Armenian Orthodox were finally acquired the legal personality in Greece. Last but not least, education. Communities' legal status and citizenship are directly interrelated to this issue. The first Armenian schools in the Greek area were established in the 18th or 19th century. Ever since the large amount of Armenian refugees arriving in Greece, the number of Armenian schools was gradually increasing. Next to the previous public communal schools, private Armenian ones were established in order to retain the Armenian character and identity. As it is obvious to the numbers presented, based on the official Greek statistics, due to various law amendments, the Armenian public schools had been gradually substituted by the private ones. In March 1936, the Minister of Education and of Religious Affairs will point out to the Armenian Church of Thessaloniki that according to the written provisions, there is no provision for the operation of an Armenian school in the Greek state, indirectly announcing the forthcoming closing of the public Armenian schools. The lack of a legal status to the Armenian community meant in practice that there was no legal status or obligation for the Greek state to retain Armenian public schools. The latter ones were operating in all previous years based on the state's timeless tolerance, which by the end of the 30s was decided to come to an end. This explains the closure in northern Greece of all existing public communities Armenian-speaking schools by the end of this decade. Several restrictions limited also the number of the private schools. One of the many main necessary conditions established during the Metaxas dictatorship regime was that the head of the school should have the civil and political rights of a Greek citizen, in other words, to have the Greek citizenship. Moreover, each private school would have as obligation to cultivate Greek education and the Greek national spirit, an obligation with an obvious impact on the Armenian language. The end of the repatriation process and the massive exodus to Soviet Armenia led to a dramatical reduction of the Armenian schools. No Armenian school in northern Greece was left, and the only ones operating were found only in Athens and Piraeus, reflecting the impact of the repatriation to Soviet Armenia on Armenian schools and the overall shrinking it caused to the Armenian local communities in Greece. The whole legislation concerning private schools was retained in combination with state's policy to keep the number of Armenian schools in Greece as small as possible, together with the policy the Armenian children to be integrated to the Greek educational system. For decades, it was a common secret the fact that schools are not exactly private, but community schools, operating with the help of Armenian organizations of abroad and thanks to community resources. During this period, a balance between the state and the Armenian community had been invented. On the one hand, state's intention to enforce the presence of Greek teachers and impose a linguistic Hellenization of students through teaching and learning of the Greek language. On the other hand, from the Armenian side, to preserve at the same time a minimum basis for continuation of the Armenian education, religion, and of national idea. To sum up, it is clear that citizenship, education, and legal status are interdependent throughout the development of the Armenian community in Greece. The law framework proved to be a key tool at the hands of the state, a tool with which the state could control the basic functioning of the community, but also the fate of its members. The absence of citizenship meant exclusion for several vital daily needs, for instance, the opportunity to find a job. It meant that an Armenian school could not be allowed to operate if there was no owner or director of a school with the Greek citizenship. It meant also an indirect pressure to find another country, as it was the case for the mass exodus of Armenians during the Greek Civil War. To all the above, there is a common denominator or a common cause. The legal regime, or to be more exact, the absence of a legal regime, which defined in many crucial moments the historical development of the Armenian community in Greece and of its members. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Levon, for a fascinating paper. Our third presentation is going to be an online presentation. Our speaker is Nicholas Al-Jeloo, an independent scholar and researcher based at Ankara in Erbil, Iraq. Nicholas has a PhD in Syriac studies and a BA in Semitic languages from Sydney University, as well as an MA in Syriac Christianity from Leiden University. Nicholas has taught classical Syriac at Sydney University and the University of Melbourne, as well as English at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. He has published a number of articles and book chapters in relation to Syriac and Assyrian studies, and is currently the English language editor of Banipal. the quarterly publication of the General Directorate for Syriac Culture and Arts in the northern region of Iraq. Nicholas's title today is An Expelled and Unwanted Minority, the Assyrians of Hakkâri. Thank you, Nicholas, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
The floor is yours.
Firstly, I'd just like to say how much of a pleasure it is to be with you all at this very interesting conference, even though it's online. And I wish the organizers the best of success for the rest of the conference. Now, currently, a significant Christian Assyrian minority numbering about 30,000 continues to reside in Turkey. The majority of them adhere to the Syriac Orthodox Church, with a minority of Chaldean and Syriac Catholics, as well as some Protestants. Now, most of these originate from Mardin, but now live in Istanbul. In many other provinces, autochthonous Assyrians retain villages, active churches, and monasteries, as well as community foundations and associations, despite dwindling numbers. Now, many indigenous Assyrians, however, were expelled from certain parts of the country during the early years of the Republican period, and their descendants today do not have the legal right to return to their homes. The bulk of this expelled population, especially from Van and Hakkâri, comprises those adhering to the Church of the East, which is the only Syriac church that has never been officially recognized or held any official status within the country since its establishment as a republic in 1923. Now, the Hakkâri Assyrians were indigenous to the area encompassing the formerly Kurdish-ruled emirate of the same name, which used to include neighboring parts of modern-day Shirnak and Van provinces. Now, the evidence for this is in the many Akkadian and Aramaic place names which local Kurds still use, despite them being changed to Turkish ones after 1940. Moreover, the Assyrians attribute their Christian conversion to the religion's early spread and maintained many churches which had been founded in the 4th and 5th centuries. Now, the majority of them adhered to the Church of the East, which flourished in the Persian Empire, outside the borders of the Roman Empire, and maintained its center at Baghdad until 1268. Now, it declared its independence from the rest of Christianity in 424, 7 years prior to the controversial Council of Ephesus, which saw the excommunication of Nestorius, who was then Bishop of Constantinople.
Beyefendi koptu ama geri gelebileceğini söylemişti. İsterseniz bekleyin,
Our
isterseniz
panelist
burada
has a connectivity problem. We might wait a little to see if he will be joining us again.
We have a connection problem, but I think Nicholas is going to be back.
geri döneceğini söylemişti. Böyle bir kesinti.
Our panelist actually warned us ahead of time that there might be some connectivity issues as he's joining us from Iraq.
Bear with us.
Okay. I apologize. I live in Iraq and we have frequent power outages. So that was one of the power outages. Okay. So, now the Council of Constantinople at the time, as well as those who agreed with his Christology. So, having originally been tied to the Patriarchate of Antioch, the school of which Nestorius had been educated in, the Church of the East upheld these teachings and stood with him. and this led to its stigmatization by the rest of the Christian world, which subsequently deemed it to be heretical, labeling it with the pejorative term Nestorian, a name which the Church of the East itself has always rejected. Nevertheless, this term, Nasturi, was used by Ottoman authorities to define the church as a religious community, and it has persisted well after the foundation of the Turkish Republic. Now, by the late 19th century, due to the conversion of many of its adherents in other areas to Catholicism in the form of the Chaldean Uniate Church, the Church of the East's remnants became limited to the Hakkâri and Botan regions of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Urmia plain in Iran. Now, the traditionalist Hakkâri Assyrians had gradually assumed a new importance from the 17th century onward, with the establishment of new dioceses in the area, culminating in the removal of the patriarchate to Kochanas by 1685. Now, prior to 1915, the Hakkâri Sanjak held the world's largest concentration of ethnic Assyrians, who numbered over 100,000 and inhabited more than 280 villages. They formed about half of Hakkâri's population, consisting an absolute majority in 2/3 of the province. They were divided into two classes: the Ashirets, who comprised 5 large tribes that paid a nominal tribute to the Ottoman state and largely conducted their own affairs in an autonomous manner, including self-defense, and the Rayats, who were Ottoman subjects that paid taxes to local government representatives and were expected to serve in the army. In Ottoman times, the Ashiret area had been known as Nasturi Arazisi, or the Nestorian territories, and was semi-independent. The Kochanas Patriarchate actually only first made contact with the Ottoman authorities in 1846. So, before the First World War, Hakkâri Assyrians had shown no enmity toward the Ottoman authorities, especially following a meeting which took place in Van on the 3rd of August 1914 between Patriarch Marshimon Binyamin and Governor Hassan Tahsin Bey, who made a number of promises to keep the Assyrians loyal. However, from August onward, Assyrians in the frontier district of Shamdinli began to flee attacks by Ottoman military units to the Urmia plain, and wholesale massacres of Assyrians by Ottoman troops were also being reported in Yüksekova, Başkale, and Saray. Despite Assyrian attempts to remain loyal to their overlords, the situation worsened, and by November 23rd, the Patriarch was forced to inquire from the Russian vice-consul in Tabriz whether or not to commence hostilities against these unwarranted attacks. After the Ottoman defeat at Sarıkamış on the 1st of January 1915, their forces invaded and occupied the Urmia and Salmas plains in Iran. More than 10,000 Assyrians died, either fleeing to Russia from disease at the American and French missions in Urmia or during raids on villages. On February 23rd, the Church of the East's bishop in Urmia, Mardincha, originally from Shamdinli, was shot dead by Ottoman troops with 42 other prominent Assyrians. In April, so this is just some pictures of Urmia. Now, in April, after a new round of massacres in Yüksekova and Başkale districts, the Patriarch convened an assembly with Hakkâri's Assyrian chieftains and lay leaders, resulting in an order for general mobilization against the apparent threat. So that June, the Patriarch left for Tabriz to meet with the Russians, requesting military aid and protection. This was taken by the Ottomans as a betrayal and declaration of war, and they began attacking the Assyrians on all sides from June 23rd. 2 weeks later, the Patriarch returned from Tabriz bearing the news that the Russians would be unable to provide direct assistance. After the last tribal district capitulated on September 15, the Assyrians had no other hope but to flee to Iran, where they could be protected. The Patriarch personally led the survivors on their trek. By October 5th, as many as 50,000 Assyrian refugees had arrived on the Salmas plain, where many of them died of starvation and disease. They were subsequently distributed among villages in the Salmas, Urmia, and Khoy districts for temporary resettlement, receiving protection and arms from the Russians who had occupied the area. Now, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Russians withdrew from Urmia. On the 16th, just some more pictures from Urmia. On the 16th of March 1918, the Patriarch, Marshamun, was murdered by Ismail Agha, also known as Simkyo, leader of the Kurdish Shikak tribe, who had pretended to be interested in an alliance with the Assyrians. That summer, Ottoman troops advanced on Urmia, breaking through the Assyrian lines of defense. So on the 31st of July, the whole Christian population in the region, numbering as many as 80,000, and including the surviving refugees from Hakkâri, began a long exodus toward Hamadan. Almost all 16,000 who remained were exterminated. And after more than a month, the 50,000 Christians who survived the exodus were sheltered by the British in a refugee camp at Baquba near Baghdad. Less than 20,000 of these were Hakkâri Assyrians, of which an additional 10 to 15,000 had found shelter in what later became the Soviet Union. So, in 1920, the refugees were moved to another camp at Mandan, near Mosul, which was then closed in May 1921. The remaining Hakkâri Assyrians were to be resettled in the north of Mosul province, and you can see some of those areas where they were to be resettled. However, instead of settling in northern Iraq, some 8,000 of them, belonging to the Tiare and Truma tribes, decided to return to their native villages, which they had been forced to abandon 6 years earlier, hoping to resume living as they had been before the war. Now, due to the area being a political no man's land, and because of the Assyrians' independent tribal nature, the returnee men were naturally armed in order to defend themselves, in the absence of police or an army to protect them. Moreover, because the Allies had won the war, they had assumed that Hakkâri had been incorporated into British-controlled Iraq and was no longer under Turkish rule. At the Lausanne Conference in 1923, some Assyrians met with Turkish representatives, stating that their armed units in Mosul were ready to leave British control and come under the command of Turkish authorities in order to serve Turkey's right to sovereignty in Mosul in exchange for autonomy in the Hakkâri province. This idea was not seriously entertained. In May and June 1924, Turkey and Britain negotiated the Mosul issue at the Golden Horn Conference. British representative Sir Percy Cox wanted Hakkâri to be returned to the Assyrians and incorporated into the Kingdom of Iraq, while Turkish representative Fethi Bey rejected the entire plan, citing that the Assyrians were a minority and arguing that despite the armed uprisings they had caused in the region, they could just as well get their old privileges back within Turkey's borders. These negotiations failed, and both parties decided to appeal to the League of Nations. On the other hand, the Turkish government had already begun efforts to organize the local Kurdish tribes while collecting the Assyrians' weapons so they wouldn't be able to defend themselves, under the pretense of preventing a British-led rebellion. That July, Hakkâri governor Halil Rifat Bey was passing from Çölemrik to Çukurca to inspect the region's tribes, in accordance with a government order. He had written to Evliya Bey, Kurdish Agha of Chal and Çukurca district administrator, telling him to inform the Assyrians not to worry about his visit. He wanted to discuss whether they had returned under British orders, in which case they would need to return to Iraq, or they wanted to live in Turkey as citizens, in which case they would be free to do so. Evliya Beg, however, informed the Assyrians of Tkhuma that the Turks were planning to expel them by force and to annihilate them. When the Assyrians under Malik Giuliana met the governor on the 7th of August, they began shooting at the Turkish convoy. The governor and 5 soldiers were injured and taken prisoner, while a gendarmerie battalion commander and 3 privates were killed. The Assyrians intended to take the prisoners to the British at Ahmadiyya, but released them after Malik Khoshaba of Lower Tiare intervened, expressing his disappointment that they had been tricked by Kurds into attacking the Turks. After learning of these events, the Turkish government labeled the incident a rebellion and decided to use force to expel the unwanted Assyrian returnees. On August 14, they placed the operation under the command of Jafer Tayyar Pasha. Turkish forces also benefited from Kurdish tribes, forming small detachments from local volunteers. Any armed Assyrians detected were to be pursued and destroyed. In total, the force gathered against them numbered over 40,000. The Turks even established contact with Simko, who had murdered the Assyrian patriarch 6 years earlier. The operation began on September 11, a very ominous date. The Assyrians were in a difficult situation and could not put up a serious resistance, since their population was limited and the majority of their fighting men were in military service with the British in Iraq. In order to protect the embattled Assyrians, British planes attacked Turkish troops from the air. Armed Assyrians dispersed, and unarmed civilians abandoned their villages, fleeing to the mountains. The British ordered the Assyrians to return to Iraq and not to cross the border again. The operation was effectively terminated on October the 2nd. Because of his help in securing the governor's release, Malik Khoshaba was permitted to remain in Turkey with 200 of his people. However, because his tribe alone numbered over 2,000 people, he refused and politely left for Iraq. Only one Assyrian family remained in Hakkâri's Çukurca district until 1935, when they also left for Iraq. In Ataturk's opening speech to the Turkish Grand National Assembly that November, he referred to serious crimes committed by some Nestorian bandits requiring special measures. This act of ethnic cleansing is recorded in official Turkish history as the Nestorian Revolt and considered the first uprising against the Republic, even though it all came from a total misunderstanding. Now, that October, the League of Nations met in Brussels to discuss the disputed border between Turkey and Iraq, naming the provisional border the Brussels Line. The Council appointed 2 consecutive commissions to investigate the situation on the ground. The second commission's final report stated that Turkish soldiers occupied villages and carried out forced deportations en masse of Hakkâri's last Assyrians, during which they fell ill or were abandoned or died of starvation and cold. It blamed the soldiers for imposing very heavy punishments and carrying out acts of violence, going as far as massacre, with Kurds being used to kill Christian Assyrians. The Brussels line was taken as the border between Iraq and Turkey, and Mosul became part of Iraq. It was also stated that Turkey should not be punished with losing Hakkâri, and that the Assyrians, to some extent, only had themselves to blame for their expulsion, and despite the broad rights that they enjoyed under the Ottomans, their demands to separate from Turkey were unjustified. I quote, "At the start of the Great War, the Assyrian people has revolted against its legal government without reason or provocation. We know this is nonsense, but incited by forces from outside." End quote. Turkish sovereignty over Hakkâri was accepted without question. On 5th of June 1926, Britain, Iraq, and Turkey entered into the Ankara Treaty. Turkey officially agreed to the Brussels line as its border with Iraq, and a permanent frontier commission was established. In their meetings, the Turkish delegation often complained about the Assyrians committing border violations, demanding that they be removed from the border region completely, for allegedly disturbing the peace. On the other hand, the Iraqis requested Turkey to allow Assyrian shepherds to pass through its border to graze their flocks, but Turkey rejected this on the grounds that they disrupted peace and order. Shepherds disrupting peace and order. By September 1927, the entire frontier had been demarcated on the ground, and the Hakkâri Assyrians were involuntarily locked out of their homeland by agreement in which they had no say. They didn't even have the right to become Turkish citizens. Between 1935 and 1990, the only Assyrians remaining in Hakkâri lived in two remote villages of Beytüşebab district, or three, I should say. Elsewhere, the Assyrians who remained were those who had been Islamized or assimilated into the local Kurdish population. The Assyrians of the village of Hassana in Şırnak's Silopi district were subsequently forced to join other Christian denominations because they could no longer maintain communication with their patriarchate in Iraq. The Nestorian Church, as Turkish authorities continued to call it, had no legal status in the new republic. It had been demonized for supposedly declaring war on the Ottoman Empire in 1915 and was thereafter perceived as a tool being used for British imperialist ambitions in the Middle East. The state confiscated properties, churches and monasteries, and some of them were even sold to private local buyers. It was not until after the First Gulf War in 1991 when many of the church's adherents from Iraq fled to Turkey as refugees that it again regained a presence in the country, albeit a transient one. There are still a few thousand Assyrian refugees belonging to the Church of the East in major Turkish cities, however, none of them in their native Hakkâri. As for the Assyrians expelled in 1915 and 1924, they have strongly maintained their tribal and village identities and still celebrate the feast days of the churches that they were forced to abandon. Hakkâri is still a major part of their psyche and remains a major feature of their songs and folk tales. They still cook foods that their ancestors ate in Hakkâri, dance the same dances, and maintain the same folk dress which they wear on special occasions. Even when they were resettled in Iraq and later Syria, they continued to organize and group themselves around the tribes and villages that they belonged to back in Hakkâri, with many of them settling near the Turkish border in the hope of one day being able to return to their former homes. Psychologically, it is as if they never left, and this is an indication of how ingrained the area is still in their minds, being its native inhabitants after all. Most dream of one day being able to return to visit where their ancestors lived for centuries, if not millennia, and many have. But the majority are still traumatized by the events that led to their expulsion and are apprehensive of how they would be received by the Kurdish locals as well as by Turkish authorities. They have also faced the problem of not knowing exactly where the villages they originate from are located now, since the names have been changed, and they also dread finding their churches and cemeteries desecrated, which is a sad fact in many cases. So, without this is my last paragraph, by the way, it's my conclusion. Without a valid official presence in Turkey, the Church of the East has been unable to do much in the way of legally contesting the current state of its former properties and historical cultural patrimony, or working on an international agreement for their preservation. While a handful of Turkish citizens still identify as adherents of this church, there aren't enough for a viable congregation because they are scattered, and many of them live between Turkey and the diaspora. In light of this, more established sister churches have offered to step in to act as guarantors of these properties or to manage them under their own religious community foundations. The main issue, though, remains one of ownership. Most of the religious sites previously belonging to the church are now registered as private or government properties. This is the main stumbling block which needs to be overcome if it actually wants to own the structures and their adjacent properties again, rather than just having them restored. Otherwise, the religious buildings can be restored while remaining in government or private hands, just in order for them to be protected, preserved, and opened for tourism. Personally, I wish that there could be a law of return for the Assyrians of Hakkâri, but I guess that's a long way away. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to tell you the Assyrian side of the story.